host this distinguished panel today. My name is Paolo von Schirach. I am the president of the Global Policy Institute here in Washington, D.C., and chair of political science and international relations at Bay Atlantic University, also here in Washington, D.C. We work together. And I'm joined here by a very distinguished panel. You have received in the invitations their basic qualifications and bios, so I will not, use our precious time by reintroducing them to you in detail. However, just Professor Cottarelli, we're very happy to have you with us today. And of course, Professor Cottarelli is a well-known, extremely well-known economist in Italy and beyond that. For those of us here in Washington, D.C., he spent many years of his long and distinguished career at the International Monetary Fund as a high fund official, and also later on as a board member, representing Italy and other countries on the board. Peter Schechter, old friend, who's been doing all kinds of different things, always at a very interesting and important level, both working on Capitol Hill, as a consultant, political consultant for many years, successfully in Washington, D.C., working primarily on Latin America, then later on with the Atlantic Council, where he was vice president and working on Latin America, but also many other issues, and currently the co-host of his own podcast, Altamar, High Seas in Spanish, I guess, which is a global affairs podcast. And last but not least, a very, very old friend, Michael Binyon. We met, longer ago than I care to admit, which was back when he was a correspondent of the Times, here in Washington, D.C., and I was working at the Atlantic Council. Michael has continued his distinguished career as a writer, as a columnist for the Times, and he continues to write and write analysis and do consulting at other levels in the UK and beyond. And so I really think that this is a very good group of people, and to try to address the admittedly ambitious topic that we set for ourselves, that is, if globalization will survive this wretched coronavirus pandemic that we're still grappling with, and that the experts are trying to figure out from a medical standpoint where we are. But of course, our point today is to try to examine the economic and policy fallout, whether it's the ripple effects on national economies, on the global economy, on fiscal policies and situations of many countries. Why don't we start with you, Professor Cottarelli, since you are, in a sense, at the not for happy reasons, in one of the epicenters of the crisis from a medical standpoint, and your city, Milan, seems to have been affected more so than others, but also, given your extensive background and expertise on the Italian economy and public expenditures, where do you see all this? Where are we? Give us a fix of where we are, and also, if it's not too much, where is the euro going to be based on the impact of negative impact on weaker countries such as Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Greece? Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. Let me just start by mentioning the projections that were published by the International Monetary Fund last Tuesday. As you may already know, the IMF is projecting a decline in world GDP by 3% this year. One may think that 3% is not very large, but let's keep one thing in mind. Since the Second World War, it never happened that GDP declined by 3%. Even in 2009, as a result of the Lehman Brothers crisis, the global financial crisis, the world GDP declined by just a few 0 point something. Here is 3 percentage points. In Europe, the decline is projected to be 7.5%. In Italy, it's projected to be 9%, over 9%. And just Greece will be doing worse. Greece, which is enormously affected because of the tourism season, which is going to be a disaster this year. So these numbers in itself are telling us that what is happening from an economic perspective is unprecedented in terms of magnitude of the shock. How long it will last, really nobody knows. In the past, the impact of pandemic was perhaps even deep, but it was short-lived. Once the medical emergency is over, the rebound in economy is pretty fast. We don't know, however, how long the emergency, the medical emergency will last. We may have a second wave in the fall. We don't know. So there is still a huge uncertainty. The IMF has made projections also for next year, projecting a rebound of the world economy, but nobody really knows. The first uncertainty relates the medical issue. The second uncertainty relates to the consequences, to the economic consequences of the crisis on top of the decline in GDP. And the big question is, what are the implications for financial markets? You mentioned the euro. So let me say something about the euro and about Italy, because it's clear that at the moment, as it has been unfortunately for the last few years, Italy is seen by financial markets as the weak link in the euro chain, the link that they may break. And we have already seen signs. Of this. There are indeed over the last few weeks several commentaries came out. For example, in the Financial Times, 3 commentaries pointing at the sharp rise in public debt to GDP ratio in Italy from an already high level. And at the end of this month, I believe Standard & Poor's will come up with a new assessment of Italy's and other countries' rating, and everybody is wondering whether there would be a downgrade. Some of these articles that appear on the Financial Times concluded that because the rise in the public debt to GDP ratio is going to be even sharper than the one that occurred in 2010, 11, and 12, we should be seeing downgrades that are at least as large, which would move, which means 3 notches. That will move Italy into junk bond territory. And so there are concerns, and in the last few days, interest rates on Italian government bonds have increased, not yet by a huge amount. Today, the Italian 10-year yield went up to 2%. We wish we had a 2% rate in 2011, 2012. Particularly at the end of 2011. 2% is not much. Why is this happening? It's happening because of a major difference with respect to 2011 and 2012. The 2011-2012 euro area crisis. The difference is that the ECB, the European Central Bank, is intervening heavily in the government paper market. After the announcement made by the ECB about at this point, we're talking about 3 or 4 weeks ago, the ECB announced a major increase in its quantitative easing operation, purchases of government paper. Since then, the interest rate on Italian government paper, which had increased beyond 3%, started declining, came down to 1.5, 1.6%, and now it's up to 2. So it's going up again. But it's still well below where it was a month ago before the ECB announcement. What is necessary to do to keep the markets quiet? Because the last thing we want is that on top of a medical crisis, on top of a GDP crisis that's inevitable, that we also have a financial crisis. That will be very, very, very dangerous. We have the ECB that is helping, but just to give you a few numbers, and then I'll close here because I don't want to speak too long at my first intervention. Just to give you a few numbers. Taking into account the deficit for Italy this year, the deficit is in balance between spending and revenue. This year is going to go up to something like The IMF says 9% of GDP, let's say 160 billion. On top of this, there is a lot of debt that is coming to maturity. Italy has a very large public debt, so a large chunk of it is coming to maturity in 2020. Altogether, deficit plus bonds are coming to maturity. The gross borrowing requirement for Italy is going to be about half a trillion euros, 500 billion euros. How much is the ECB buying? Based on current policies, about 220 billion, including its share of its own debt held by the ECB, Italian debt held by the ECB coming to maturity, 220 billion. The program that so far have been launched by the European, or been proposed by the European Commission and by the Eurogroup, namely the so-called Schirach to finance unemployment benefits, and the ESM, the special window of the ESM. If Italy decided to take it, which is very controversial in Italy, these two together would yield about 50 billion. So 220 from the ECB, 50 billion from these facilities, we get to 270. To be 100% sure that Italy will not have to borrow anything from financial markets, we need another 230 billion. Obviously, we don't need really 230 billion because some buying from financial market of Italian government paper will occur. But perhaps one can believe that there will be no foreign investment in Italy. That in itself would imply a loss of 100 billion. So we need to close the gap as much as possible. And the tool that would use close the gap are the Eurobonds. That's why Italy and other countries have insisted so much on the introduction of Eurobonds. We cannot call them Eurobonds because Northern Europe doesn't like the term Eurobonds because they believe that Eurobond is equal to mutualization of past public debt.
Yes.
We don't want mutualization of past public debt.
All right.
A possibility is to call them recovery bonds, and so there will be money that is borrowed together, and then together we decide in Europe how to use it. I think this is a politically feasible solution.
Well, thank you very much for this comprehensive overview, Professor Cottarelli. We understand, therefore, basically, in layman's terms, there is a containment. In other words, for the moment, it seems that the actions, as you indicated, promoted by the European Central Bank, have limited the damage. As you indicated, it would have been nice if in 2011 the spread between Italy's 10-year bonds and German bonds had been 2%, it would be fantastic. So the fact that we are at this level, it's somewhat comforting. The question is, depending on how long this disaster continues, if the bank and other financial solutions can hold the line and allow Italy and other countries, Italy is certainly not alone in this, to survive this crisis, and whether or not this creates cracks in the edifice of European solidarity, the Eurozone, etc. Michael, I am coming to you now. I mean, the obvious question to you is, you're in London, and of course, for 2 or 3 years, the only topic in London, right, was Brexit. And you had this, rather amazing election in which, Boris Johnson, defying all the prognostications, landed a fantastic political victory, which seemed to put him solidly in command. And then this happens. And of course, he also got sick, as we know. So which adds a little bit additional drama. So where are we on this? In other words, the UK, as everybody else, is confronting the ripple effects of the health epidemic. But we're trying to look further ahead. What's the future for England? Where is the British economy going to go, assuming a happy ending for Brexit, which at some point will be sealed? What's your view? And from your perspective, how do you view the UK, Britain, and potentially, countries beyond Western Europe?
Well, the real problem is that Britain at the moment is drifting because the Prime Minister is sick. And he has been quite severely ill. In fact, he was in intensive care and therefore he is going to take at least a month or so to recuperate. Doctors will probably not allow him to take command of the government properly for several weeks more. Without him in charge, there isn't really any mechanism for having an agreed cabinet policy, because we don't have a system of having a deputy prime minister. There's nobody already designated as deputy. That being so, it means that the decisions taken by the cabinet are really just temporary holding decisions. And there seems to be a lack of unity on a whole lot of different issues right now, namely when and whether Britain should agree to some form of timetable for ending the lockdown. If so, on what terms, whether we should follow what others in Europe are doing, or whether or not we can cope with the health crisis. All these various things, at the moment, the decisions are still pending. And there is, I won't say disagreement, but there are different views in the British cabinet. The main difficulty, of course, is the views of the economists, particularly the Chancellor of the Exchequer, essentially our finance minister, and the health secretary, both of whom have different agendas. The Chancellor of the Exchequer would like to see Britain get back to normal or get back working as soon as possible, because there is a real problem about the longer the lockdown goes on, as in every country, the greater the economic damage. Already they're forecasting a drop of 35% in GDP. Now that is pretty extraordinary, that drop. The idea may be that it's a V shape and that it will rebound very quickly, but that's uncertain. Amid all this, we have, as you have rightly said, the whole question of what to do about Brexit. Most people, in fact, the overwhelming majority in the country, think, for goodness sake, forget about Brexit for now. We've got other things to fix. But that's not the government's view. Officially, the Brexit timetable remains as it was. And that means that Britain has a very tight timetable in which to negotiate a new trade and economic and political relationship with its former partners in the European Union. They have to have a deal in place by the end of December. Now we're talking only months away, and nobody is in a fit state to negotiate anything at the moment. First of all, they can't meet. It all has to be done as we're doing with Zoom or over the internet. That's not a satisfactory way to negotiate things. Secondly, British industry is in no state to start taking on the extra burden of transforming itself, ready to accommodate the different arrangements that may be put in place with Brexit. The transition would have to be at least 6 months and possibly a year longer than it is at the moment. Now that's politically very difficult for Boris Johnson, who's made his reputation by saying, we will get it done, get Brexit done. But the rest of the country, quite honestly, thinks that this is just a pipe dream to think that this sort of thing can be going ahead, as well as trying to solve the economic and, above all, the health pandemic, the health crisis thrown up by COVID-19. So there really is a big question mark as to what decisions Britain will take or can take in the absence of any leadership for at least 2 or 3 weeks more.
If I can press this just a little further, Michael, one of the great ideas that were at least bandied about during the political campaign leading to the election of Boris Johnson said we're going to make Singapore on the Thames, right? We are going to be this new re-engineered, high-tech, highly entrepreneurial, go-getter country. And yes, we're going to do it because we now, the world is our oyster because we're freed from the shackles of Europe, blah, blah, blah. Now, given what's happening to the global economy, again, is there any talk about this? Or as you said a moment ago, well, this is for later. This can't deal with this. We can't not, walk and chew gum, as they say here in the United States. It's too complicated to do this at the same. Or are there British groups or multinational corporations based in the UK that said, no, we're working on this. We are retooling, we are reorganizing, or simply it's an impossibility at this time.
It is an impossibility. It's an impossibility at this time. And nobody knows what the future global economy will look like. I mean, we've heard the prognostications of Professor Cottarelli about the enormous effect this is going to have just within Europe. If you look at the wider world, I mean, it's almost impossible to forecast. And talk about Singapore, well, that's a most unfortunate comparison at the moment, given that Singapore has just been hit with a second whammy of coronavirus, and they, having more or less escaped earlier, they're now seriously in trouble, and they have a very severe lockdown. The idea that Britain could be a sort of offshore Singapore, frankly, is just for the birds. I mean, it is a pipe dream. And I think even the most ardent Brexiteers think that an economy as large as Britain's, and I think it is still the 5th largest economy in the world, it's quite a big economy, although obviously dwarfed by our former partners in the European Union. The fact that such an economy could go on its own as a sort of niche market, rather like Singapore, that seems to be utterly unrealistic, and nobody is talking about that sort of thing at the moment. The most that people are saying is that leaving the European Union will give Britain the freedom to cast aside a certain amount of regulatory processes that have hampered a certain amount of initiative. Now, at the moment, there's a crying need for initiative, mostly in the medical sphere. And I have to say that at the moment, a certain amount of initiative is being shown, that there are, for example, high-speed and very efficient laboratories working on a vaccine. Well, that's just in the medical sphere. There is no lack of eagerness to start initiative, but not in the way that one would talk about a sort of freewheeling Singapore-type economy. That really is utterly unrealistic.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Now, Peter, give us, we saved the best for last here. Give us a bit of a sense from where you are of what's been done here in the US. We know we've passed the largest, how can I say, stimulus package in US history, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think there's anything comparable to the 2.2 trillion, which, by the way, it's not the final word on the amount of money that Washington is throwing at all these problems, whether it's about the credit guarantees, direct help, supporting the airlines, giving money directly to people, etc., etc. And then, just to make it easier for you, also give us a sense of how the crisis is affecting and is likely to affect Latin America, especially the major economies, Mexico, Brazil, and others. Peter.
Yeah, I'm glad for your very small question. Thank you, Paolo. let me just start with I've spoken to many. I know that the audience for this program is both in Europe and in the US. So I've been speaking to a number of friends of mine on a very personal basis to start. There is a major difference in what the lockdown, and I use that word lockdown carefully, feels like here in the United States versus what it feels like in Europe. Here, as opposed to friends in Spain or Italy or the United Kingdom or Belgium, where really there is an inability to leave houses. Children have been inside homes for a month now. Nobody is leaving the street. Here, my European friends are completely impressed by the fact that sort of we are told that we must all go out jogging and we must take walks in the middle of the day. I mean, my European friends sort of faint when they hear this, which just I think is a way to introduce the massive difference not only between the United States and Europe, but the massive differences within the United States. I mean, here there has been we have had the Federalist Papers were written approximately 200 years ago, but we have had a resurgence of a discussion that really only has occurred when with Alexander Hamilton and the play that came out, the musical that came out earlier. But now there's a real discussion about what federalism is and what it feels like, because you have massive disagreements among governors and among governors of groups of governors with the federal government. As you said, Paolo, we have now gone through $2.2 trillion that are divided roughly in $1,200 checks going to pretty much every American who makes $75,000 or so, helping small businesses and sort of bailouts of major industries that have been hardest hit. There's another $450 billion that is going to be passed this week. So now we're at about $2.7 trillion in expenditures that have
and that would be for
just
small business, right?
That is mostly directed at small business and at hospitals.
Yes.
That have lost tremendous amounts of money. But notwithstanding the amounts of money spent, we have an economic devastation here that we have not seen in 100 years since the Great Depression. And the only question here is how long it lasts. We have 22 million people who have gone on the unemployment rolls in 1 month's time. And it's very, very important for your non-American audiences to understand that we Americans receive our health insurance through our work, not from the government. And therefore, most of the people have now also not only lost their jobs, but also lost their health insurance. And therefore, there is a huge now burden that has been added on to the health burden of the pandemic, which is the health burden of the fact that people are now running, 22 million Americans are now without health insurance and now are asking themselves what they should do for all the other problems that they may have that are non-pandemic related. The other thing that has come out in this pandemic is the enormous and overwhelming inequality that the pandemic has sort of basically torn off a Band-Aid, which sort of until now had a little bit been hidden, the way the overwhelming inequality in healthcare in the United States. You have overwhelming numbers of African Americans that have been hit by this pandemic. I mean, the numbers are really almost hard to believe. In cities like Detroit or Chicago, 50 to 60% of the deaths are among the African American community. And this is leading to a whole new discussion here in the United States about how we achieve economic fairness, but also fairness in terms of the social quality of life. I personally am very worried. I think all the speakers have already talked about the big question is how long this lasts. And so I'm personally very worried about social unrest exploding should this last longer, because our social safety net is so different from Europe's safety net, and it's so much more precarious. It leaves me really concerned that if we are talking about lockdowns that last months longer into the future, or we have a release only to be followed by another lockdown, this is really concerning. From a policy perspective, I think we're already seeing a new American nationalism on the growth, on top of the nationalism that already this administration has already brought. We're seeing this in all of the growing attacks on China. And I think that one thing is clear to me is that the Chinese supply chains, at least to the United States, are not something. We're not going to come out of this crisis with the same Chinese supply chains that we had in the past. Remember, I would say last about in this part of my my remarks. Remember that this year is an election year, and everything, absolutely everything in America is going to be seen through a political lens. And it is clear that the administration is going to have to respond to, I think, 3 large failings, 2 of which we've seen already, and the third of which we're about to see. One is the inability to prepare or to foresee the crisis in an appropriate manner. The second one is an inability to manage the crisis in ways that brings the country together. And the third one is an inability to open the economy again, because we have no tests in the United States. Unlike South Korea or Germany, we do not have any capacity to test. young friend of Carlo Cottarelli, a friend of Carlo Cottarelli's and my granddaughter was sick this weekend, very high fever. Of course, the parents believed that she could have the virus. She called, the parents called a hospital on Saturday morning and were told there are no tests available in the Washington region on a weekend. So, I mean, we're nowhere on tests. So that's about the United States. We can talk, let me just quickly say that the Latin American response has been vastly different. Just if you compare Colombia and El Salvador, to take a South American and a Central American country, versus the response of Brazil and Nicaragua, which have been, in the case of Brazil, delayed, haphazard, different governors with different things. The president is President Bolsonaro is a complete non-believer in locking down the country. Nicaragua still continues to have done nothing. It's almost not mentioned in the press, versus Colombia and El Salvador that ordered lockdowns, closures of airspace, closures of airports, even before the United States did. So there has been a vast difference in the response. But, you know, I think that one of the great yet undiscussed questions is how the pandemic is going to affect the developing world. And, you know, my guess is both in terms of the healthcare systems, which just don't have the ability to respond like in industrialized countries, but also in terms of the economic difficulties. It's going to be a really, really dramatic hit in the developing world.
Thank you, Peter. Just let me press you on two things. Of course, the world knows, but we should emphasize the extraordinary dimensions of the bilateral U.S.-China trade relationship. Of course, we know also, and the world knows, that there has been trouble in that area due to President Trump's policies of trying to redress what he saw. From his standpoint, the real problem being the trade imbalance, which most economists, I think, would disagree that is the problem. However, there is an agreement, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you have the pulse of what's going on in Washington, that surprisingly, there's now a strong bipartisan consensus. That's the way I see it. I would like to know your opinion. Between Democrats and Republicans, who usually agree on nothing, but they seem to all agree on a get tough on China policy. And therefore, as you mentioned, global supply chains, which certainly regarding U.S. companies, rely heavily on inputs from China, or whatever. China is the aggregator for inputs that it gets from other countries in Asia, then they end up in China, and then they end up here. How realistic is it, in your view, to reshuffle all this? I mean, this is something that's been going on for 20 years or more. Can we do this? People say, oh, let's move away from China. Is it doable, first of all? And then do you see other geopolitical consequences in the further cooling of relations between the two largest economies in the world, China and the US? What's your view?
Well, first of all, I completely agree with you, Paolo, that there is a surprising bipartisan feel to the criticism of the administration. I happen to have seen a leaked version of a Biden advertising that now is all about how Trump is too easy on China. It is definitely, there is a bipartisan sense that what we have now seen through this pandemic is a far too close relationship, close dependence, I'm going to use the word dependence, on China. And so, I think that we're going to see, I don't know that this relationship, which is so deep, in terms of the supply chain is going to be from one day to the other revamped. But there is no doubt that whether it's in pharmaceuticals, petrochemicals, high tech, there is going to be, I think, whether there's a Republican administration or a Democratic administration, I think there's going to be incentives to come home and bring back and bring away from China a dependence on a Chinese supply chain for precursor chemicals, for important inputs into pharmaceuticals, dependence on chips for high tech, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this is something that is going to be, if this is real and this is true, this is something that's very good news for countries like Mexico or Brazil or Colombia, because they will never be in the same place as China, as seen as sort of whatever problems we may have with immigration in this country, we still see Latin America as very much our area and a potential for partnership. So, you know, I think one of the, what you call a reshuffle, I don't think that the deck can be reshuffled, but I think there are key cards in the deck that are going to be exchanged. And this could be some good news for Latin America if those cards are indeed exchanged, which I think there's a high probability that there will be, whatever administration there is.
Well, thank you, Peter. Professor Cottarelli, back to you now. Can you give us a sense of the ability? I mean, you gave us a comprehensive picture of the fiscal environment in the Eurozone and what the ECB has done, and how Italy, you know, being caught in the middle of all this, is coping. But give us a sense of, from where you are, of the strength of the Eurozone economies in general, and their ability to, notwithstanding having to cope with this huge blow and the cost of managing the fallout of coronavirus, the vitality of the Eurozone or the EU in general, and indeed, how does Europe look at the global economy post coronavirus from your perspective? Thank you. We have no voice. We cannot hear you.
Okay.
Okay. No, yes. Thank you.
If we go back, if we go back the last few years after the 2011-2012 euro area crisis, the euro area has not been doing very badly compared to the US economy. Growth has been lower, but only because population growth was lower. In per capita terms, with the exception of the last quarters of 2011, let's say with the exception of 2011, the euro area was showing a healthy growth after 2012. So there is no reason in itself why the euro area cannot recover well from this shock. The thing that concerns me, however, are two. One is, I already mentioned, there are some countries that are under pressure. One of them is Italy. And if this financial pressure increased, and if the European Central Bank were not willing to step up fully in support of the countries under pressure, then you end up with the euro area crisis, which will be worse than the one in 2011-2012. And might end up, well, it's very difficult to anticipate how it would end up. One possibility is that some countries would have to leave the euro area. A small parenthesis here. On May 5th, I believe, the Germany's Constitutional Court will have to take a decision, I believe, on these quantitative easing operations undertaken by the ECB. There are some people in Italy here who will believe that this is going to be the end of the euro because the Constitutional Court would declare these things illegal. I don't think it will happen. But that gives you the idea of the expectations that some part of Europe or some part of Italy as regarding this decision. So if there is a euro area crisis, it may end up with one or more countries leaving the euro area. So the first issue is the euro area crisis, not necessarily in the next few weeks. It may happen later on as a result of what is happening currently. For example, I mentioned that in the US as well as in Europe, all this public debt that is being used to have this support of the economy is mostly financed by printing money, by the Fed in the US, by the ECB. If this starts having an impact on inflation, maybe the US will not care. But in Europe, there are some countries that do care quite a lot about inflation. So if inflation started going up next year, for example, then you're going to hear very strong complaints from Germany, for example. And so this will create tension. So this is the first thing that I'm worried about, the financial tensions within the euro area. But then there is another issue. These tensions and the discussions about what Europe should do and the solidarity and the lack of solidarity and all that stuff, it's created a huge animosity, at least in Italy, perhaps also in other countries, vis-à-vis the European institutions and vis-à-vis Northern Europe. So the people, according to some polls, the amount of people that, Italian people that would be in support of leaving the euro area, not the euro area, the European Union, and therefore also the euro area, is about 50% at the moment, which is huge. The surge has been huge. So this is on top of everything else. We have also possible a political crisis within the euro area. I'm talking about possibility, but there is a danger that the animosity that is we have not forgotten the last 2,000 years. Europe has spent 2,000 years with wars. I'm the first European. I always regarded myself to be very lucky because I was in the first generation of Europeans who have not fought a war in Europe. We don't have to fight a war in Europe. Was I so lucky, or it will happen again? We don't know. But I'm concerned about also this political tension, that even if they don't result in a war, hopefully, they are certainly resulting of a distancing between countries within Europe, and possibly to the breakup of the European Union project.
Thank you. That's quite sobering. Michael, back to you and your perspective from London. So you already told us that clearly Brexit has taken a back seat, that there's no way that things can be done, the way the government wanted to do and advertised during the political campaign that saw the victory of the Conservatives. But, and of course, as we all agree, and we all don't know, much of what's going to happen is dependent on the on how this pandemic will resolve itself. If it's all over in a week, there's one scenario. If it goes on, God forbid, for a few more months, we're really in deep water. So, from where you are, Michael, and you were mentioning before some hopeful signs of vitality, right? Of entrepreneurship and companies, especially in the medical field, rushing to the trenches, so to speak, and trying to be innovative and doing all these things. Do you see, again, can you tell us what the general spirit is? Are people in the UK confident that this emergency, the medical emergency, and of course the ripple effects on the economy, is going to be over soon, magically or whatever? Or is the sense, oh, no, this is not going to be over soon, this is going to be months and months, and therefore this affects the mood of companies, of investors, of potentially inflows of foreign direct investments? How do you view all this, Michael?
Well, the one thing that has come out of this dreadful situation is an extraordinary new sense of community. People felt that Britain was riven from top to toe by the Brexit arguments that lasted 2 or 3 years. There was a sense that there was regional disparities. There was the possibility of the breakup, a real possibility of the breakup of the United Kingdom, with Scotland pushing for a second referendum on independence, Northern Ireland possibly voting to join the Republic of Ireland, and the whole idea of the different regions of Britain pitted against each other, all of them rather resentful of the rich South and London in particular. Almost overnight, all that has vanished. There's been a sudden resurgence of a feeling of we have an old history, we are a people that are one, and we will help each other. And the spirit of voluntarism is absolutely extraordinary. There was a famous, well, I mean, there is a famous man of 90, he's 99 years old, and he decided to try to raise money for the National Health Service, which I have to say at the moment is something like, you know, God and everything sacred all in one. It is the most revered institution in Britain. He decided to walk around his garden 100 times to raise £1,000 for the National Health Service. He has raised, at the moment, £23 million by doing that. And people are saying, if one man walking around his garden can raise that amount of money from a community, there is hope that we can pull together. Now that's a hopeful sign that the country is going to be more at peace with itself, more at ease with itself. It's also helped along by having a new leader of the Labour Party who has put aside all the shenanigans and stupidities of the far left groups that more or less destroyed the Labour Party in the last 3 or 4 years. That doesn't mean, however, that even if the country is more at peace with itself, it's going to be any easier to grapple with the economic challenges thrown up, or to be more attractive to investors from outside. I think nobody has any idea what the overseas atmosphere, well, every country is looking at every other country, sometimes with belief, sometimes with envy. We're looking at Germany with envy because of its extraordinary success in producing testing, which many people say is going to still be the key to any ending of the lockdown. We're looking with amazement at Sweden, which has so far not introduced any lockdown and yet doesn't seem to have had a huge surge in cases, though there are more than the other Scandinavian neighbors. And we're looking with some bitterness at those countries that took action before Britain, such as Ireland, which has had correspondingly lower death rates. Britain was slow in getting going, slow to order a lockdown, and there is a feeling that after all this is over, there's going to be some hard questions and inquiries. But at the moment, the country is, I won't say at peace with itself, but it is a feeling that it's pulling together. Helped, I would say, and this is just a plug that I think actually has been effective also in America, helped by a timely intervention of a 93-year-old woman, namely the Queen, who, as a symbol of continuity, rose to the occasion. Obviously, the words were carefully chosen, but the words were extraordinarily effective in giving the country a sense that we are one country. We are not riven by regional state disputes as the US seems to be at the moment. We do seem to react cohesively. That doesn't put us in any better position for economic investment, for economic challenges. It depends, as everyone else has said, how long this lasts, how quickly the resurgence can begin. The furlough for all the workers and payment for them was meant to last 3 months, and 3 months' money has been put aside. If it's any longer, then really everything's up for grabs. Nobody quite knows where the economy will go.
We will succeed, said the Queen, right, in her speech, that I watched a few times, I have to say. And I have to say that you know, as the head of state, she gave some example of steadiness and resilience. So you know, that's pretty good. But
Paolo, can I just say
sure.
what John
Absolutely,
said?
Peter.
My daughters came to dinner. My daughters are 22 and 20 years old. They're at home. We have the pleasure of having them at home because college was closed. So they're back at home, and they came down last night to dinner and said, "Did you see what this gentleman did this older gentleman did in the United Kingdom, where he walked for the $23 million that John just told us about?" And how excited they were. So when you say he not only riveted the Britain, but he also captured the imagination of young people all over the world. We in America have nothing like that. We hear heroic stories every single day about the doctors and nurses and orderlies and ambulance drivers and police on the front line. But we have nothing like that that has brought our nation together. Indeed, while we were just talking, my phone got a CNN notification saying that the protests in state capitals around the United States with signs saying freedom over fear are just growing every day now. It seems like here in the United States, we're able to agree on precious little. The fights that are about opening versus remaining closed, about where this pandemic has hit worst on racial lines, the fights are on economic lines, the fights are on geographical lines with governors from the northeastern states, from Pennsylvania to Maine, and the Western Pacific states, from California to Washington state, have now gotten together in two separate coalitions to they themselves figure out when is the right time to open, and basically insinuating, without saying it, of course, insinuating that whatever the president says is completely irrelevant for them. They will make their decisions on their own time. So we are, this pandemic is nowhere near creating the sense of togetherness that seems to be happening in Great Britain.
The same is happening a bit in Italy. For instance,
Thank you.
the same is happening in Italy. This is not a federal state, but we have regions, and since the early 70s, these regions started having more in the autonomy. And every day there is a fight between this region, between South and North. And within the North, between the strategy followed by Veneto, the ones followed by Lombardy, the one followed by Emilia-Romagna. So there is, and the fight between the governors and the regions and the central government. So fortunately, we look much more like the US than the United Kingdom.
Paolo, can I come in and just pick
sure.
up one or two things?
And also we have to take a couple of questions, but please,
yes,
come in.
exactly.
Yes.
Those are the questions I wanted to pick up that flashed up on the screen. One was,
Yes.
what about the developing countries? And this is a thing that Britain is pretty concerned about because, of course, although it's never been a very central feature of our political life, Britain is a member of the 53-nation Commonwealth of Nations, and this includes almost a third of the world's population. I mean, if you include, countries such as India, at least 1.3 billion, India is going to see the most dreadful suffering. Africa has not yet seen suffering, but Nigeria, if you can imagine, should the pandemic get out of control there, one can only imagine that the chaos that would result, not only economically, but in human terms. And India, where you've had millions of people walking hundreds of miles to try to get home when a lockdown was imposed at 4 hours' notice. These are questions that we in Europe and in the developed world have sort of not really focused on. I mean, we're still too busy looking after our own issues and our own people. But these are extraordinarily dangerous developments in parts of the world, and the Middle East as well, already racked by war. One can only imagine the suffering that would happen in refugee camps if coronavirus just runs through unchecked.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you, Michael, for picking up on that. We have had a few, it seems like a few observations and questions about the ripple effects of all this in emerging countries. So maybe I can turn this back to you, Peter. Obviously, some countries in Latin America, Central America are middle-income countries, and some are poorer countries. So is there anything under these extraordinary circumstances? Do you see the possibility of the international community rising to the challenge, Peter, regarding doing something more to help emerging countries? Just as a quick example, we know that during the Bush administration, Bush #2, an extraordinarily large effort was launched in Africa via PEPFAR, which was the largest ever initiative to supply antiretroviral drugs to the badly hit African countries where people were literally dying, by the millions of AIDS. Can we see something like that as we are all kind of concentrating on what's happening at home and trying to, prevent the high water Altamar from taking over? Or in other words, is there going to be some kind of an international effort to try to take care of those who are far worse off than we are? And we are already badly in bad shape. What do you see, especially regarding Latin America, Peter?
I think there will be an international effort. Already, friends of yours and mine who work at the World Bank and at the IMF are talking already about massive efforts to reprogram funds that were planned for the future, to reprogram those funds to purposes to fight the pandemic and to help countries fight the pandemic. I would say that I think there is a recognition that there must be an important effort to help those who are far poorer and whose economies will be much more affected. So the answer to your question is partial. Yes, there will be an effort, but no, I think Latin America will be the least affected by that international help. I think Central America, Haiti, and others of the poorest countries in Latin America will be, might receive some assistance, but the large countries where the predominant numbers of citizens of Latin America live, which is in Mexico and in South America, I don't think are going to receive a lot of international assistance. I think certainly there is now a burgeoning effort on debt relief, which I think is not an unimportant issue, and one that will certainly is important to all of the Latin American countries, big and small. But I think in terms of actual, relief efforts, I think countries like Brazil and Mexico are sort of and Colombia, or Chile are too far down the line to be receiving international assistance. I think that a lot of that international assistance is going to be going to the poorest in Asia and Africa, and not to the majority of Latin America. In that sense, I'm afraid these countries are on their own. Healthcare in these countries has gone through an enormous improvement in the last 15 years. I mean, there have been, both in terms of the amount of monies that governments spend on healthcare, the availability of that healthcare, where it is, how widespread it is disseminated in rural health clinics, mobile clinics in different areas of the countries. I think people don't understand what an improvement there has been in health issues in countries like Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, Brazil in the last 15 years. But none of that gets even close to what is needed to fight something like this. Still the numbers of ICU beds and emergency care facilities are way below what is needed to fight something like this. So no amount of dramatic improvement can actually take on this fight.
Thank you, Professor Cottarelli. If you can go back to your days here in Washington at the IMF, one thing that we have seen in terms of financial flows as that crisis hit is huge amounts of money, of investments mostly from Africa, leaving. About $100 billion, that's a number I've seen, maybe it's inaccurate right now, which really, this was kind of a hard fought for FDI that Africa in particular needs desperately to join for good the global economy. And we've seen, and of course, the understanding is where is everybody going to knock to get more money? That would be the IMF, your old workplace. So how do you view this? In other words, is the IMF or other international financial instruments able to replace or rebalance this outflow of FDI from from countries whereby, you know, companies that are in need, that cannot meet payroll here in the US, they're, or whatever, or in Europe, they're taking money out. How do you see that? Is that going to hit very badly Africa in particular?
Well, it's not only the IMF, it's also the World Bank. So I think there is an ongoing surge of requests, both to the IMF and the World Bank, from Africa and other low-income countries. I don't think at the moment. The IMF has a lack of firepower. You see, there is one big difference with respect to the 2008 crisis through 2012 crisis. In that crisis, advanced economies were hit, and those economies are much larger and needed a lot of money. So a lot of the firepower of the IMF was absorbed in Greece, Ireland, in Portugal, and a few others smaller like Cyprus and things like this. These countries at the moment are facing the crisis on their own. For the moment, they don't need money from the IMF. So there is more money from the emerging country world. There is one thing, however, that is different. In 2008, 2009, the G20 were very prompt in responding to the crisis. Now the G20 are almost completely absent. There was a conference call, I believe, among the G20 leaders, and that's it. There has been nothing from the G20. This makes me wonder whether yet another casualty or the final hit on multilateralism has not come from the coronavirus crisis. Will there be again a G20 group that will take decisions as they took in 2008, 2001? I don't think so, at least not in the foreseeable future.
Thank you. I think, gentlemen, we are reaching the end of our allotted time. If there's time perhaps for any final quick parting note, Michael?
Well, I would just say one country we've not mentioned at all, which is very much in people's minds and certainly was until the virus struck, which is Russia. Putin has been invisible. He seems to have abnegated responsibility for anything going on there. They've been quite lucky in that they haven't had yet a severe hit. Moscow, I think, has had quite a lot. But there has been a great deal of worry that Russians are still rather busy engaging in propaganda on this. Both Russia and China seem to see this as a golden opportunity to make a certain amount of rather disingenuous propaganda about how much they're helping others and what's being done. This does seem to bode ill for future. We've already talked about the presumed increase in tensions with China, but I think it's not going to be any easier to knit up relations with Russia after this is over either. And I think Russians themselves are beginning to wonder where their government is when this is going on.
Thank you. Peter? Any parting thoughts?
I think we are, from here in America, we are sort of very uncertain of what is going to happen next in the world. It concerns me how we are unable to get beyond the politics in this country and come together, as John just described it. And so I think we are in for a difficult year economically, from a health perspective, and a campaign that will put everything through a very dirty political lens.
Thank you. Professor Cottarelli? Will the euro survive?
No, I don't know. I hope so.
We all do.
Something good, however, will come out of this. We are learning new things, like using these tools to meet without having to walk around or driving a car, polluting the countries. So I hope there will be some silver lining out of this.
Well, many thanks. With a more optimistic note here, gentlemen, thank you so much for your participation. I hope we can have you again. Maybe we'll talk about something perhaps more hopeful as things ease off on the health front. And my heartfelt thanks to my good friend and colleague Denise Caritas, who has been busy putting all this together for all of us. And with that, on behalf of the Global Policy Institute and Bay Atlantic University here in Washington, D.C. I bid you farewell. Be safe. And as I say to everybody, wash your hands. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.